In March of 1958, every sparrow in China was sentenced to death, not metaphorically. The Eurasian tree sparrow, the gray-brown bird that nested in farmhouse eaves and ate from grain fields across the country, was named by Chairman Mao Zedong as one of 4 pests to be eliminated from Chinese soil. The People's Daily ran the decree. 400 million people went to work. They chased sparrows from their perches until the birds dropped from exhaustion. They smashed nests from the eaves of farmhouses and schoolhouses. They drummed and waved red cloth from rooftops for 12-hour stretches, keeping birds aloft until their hearts gave out. Children collected sparrow eggs by the basketful. In Beijing alone, 1 week's count came to more than 1 million dead birds. 3 years later, somewhere between 15 and 45 million people in China had starved to death. The range is that wide because the Chinese government counted nothing and acknowledged nothing. And somewhere in the Chinese customs records from 1959, there is a number that makes the story worse. China exported grain that year, 4 million metric tons of it. While the dying was already beginning in the countryside, but the story does not start with the birds. If you had asked any agricultural official in China at the start of 1958 whether eliminating sparrows would improve the harvest, they would have told you, yes. The birds ate grain from the field and from storage. There was science, or what was being called science, to support the conclusion. They had no idea what the birds were actually doing. But understanding what the birds were actually doing would have required attending to the entire food chain, not only to the fraction of the harvest that the birds consumed. The 4 Pests campaign was one component of the Great Leap Forward, the plan Mao Zedong announced in 1957 to transform China from an agrarian nation into a modern industrial power inside 15 years. The campaign was launched in full in 1958, after the second plenary session of the 8th Central Committee reorganized the rural countryside into people's communes, eliminated private farming, and set production targets at a central level. The Great Leap Forward reached into everything. It reached into the eaves of farmhouses where sparrows nested. By mid-1958, approximately 500 million rural Chinese had been organized into roughly 26,000 people's communes. Private farming was abolished. Individual households no longer owned their fields, their tools, or their grain. Production targets were set by the commune administration, fulfilled through collective labor, and reported upward through a chain of party officials to provincial and central authorities. The system had no built-in mechanism for honest reporting. An official who reported a bad harvest risked being labeled insufficiently committed to the revolution. An official who reported a good harvest received praise, resources, and continued standing. The incentive structure was, from the beginning, oriented toward fiction. But in 1958, the fiction was still close enough to the harvest that the consequences were not yet visible. The 4 pests to be eliminated were rats, which ate stored grain, flies, which spread disease, mosquitoes, which spread malaria, and sparrows, which ate grain in the field. The People's Daily published diagrams showing how many caddies of grain a single sparrow consumed over the course of a year. Party officials organized competitions between work units for the highest sparrow kill count. Schools released their students to spend full days banging iron pots and drums to keep birds from landing. The military was deployed in some provinces to assist. It was organized with the same intensity as a military campaign, because, from the leadership's perspective, it was one. The intellectual framework behind this decision was not simply political. Soviet agricultural science, particularly the Lysenkoist movement that had dominated under Stalin, had shaped Chinese academic institutions throughout the 1950s. Lysenkoism rejected orthodox genetics and held that environments could be fundamentally remade by collective effort. It had devastated Soviet agricultural research in the decades before. Its assumptions traveled east and shaped how Chinese agronomists thought about the relationship between birds and crops, as a simple subtraction problem. Fewer sparrows would equal more grain remaining in the field. But the subtraction left out the rest of the equation. What that equation did not account for was every other organism in the same ecosystem. Zheng Zuoxin, China's leading ornithologist and a researcher at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, had raised this objection before the campaign began. Writing through the Academy and in scientific publications, he argued that sparrows were not simply grain thieves. They consumed enormous quantities of insects, locusts, larvae, caterpillars, and the full range of invertebrates that also fed on the same crops. Remove the sparrow, and the insects it had been suppressing would multiply without check. The warning was recorded in the proceedings of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Zheng had spoken carefully, with evidence, the insect-sparrow relationship, the cascade effects, the precedent from ornithological research elsewhere. The record shows his argument was understood, but the record also shows that the campaign proceeded as planned. The campaign went forward. By the end of 1958, by the Communist Party's own accounting, roughly 1 billion sparrows had been killed across China. The Eurasian tree sparrow population across agricultural regions had collapsed. But the collapse of the sparrow was not visible in those harvest reports. The reports coming back to Beijing from the communes, meanwhile, were extraordinary. Officials announced a grain harvest of 270 million tons for 1958, later revised upward to 375 million tons. The numbers were extraordinary because they were, in very large part, invented. But the fiction served the system, and the system was now committed to it. If the campaign had stopped there, if the sparrow had simply been removed from the ecosystem and nothing else had changed, this would already be a story about the dangers of ideological science. But the sparrow campaign was only one moving part in a system that was failing simultaneously on every level. The clock was already ticking. China just could not hear it yet. This is where the story goes irreversible. In the spring of 1959, the insects came. Without the sparrows, locust populations across eastern and central China expanded without constraint. The Eurasian tree sparrow was the primary check on these insect populations in the paddy and grain-growing regions of central and eastern China. A single breeding pair and their offspring consumed several kilograms of insects across a growing season. Remove that suppression, and the infestation levels that followed were not a natural fluctuation. They were the predictable results of removing a keystone species from an ecosystem that had depended on it for centuries. But that ecological argument was not available to anyone in Beijing who was reading the harvest reports from 1958. Waves of Locusta migratoria, the migratory locust, swept through Anhui, Henan, and Sichuan provinces. Caterpillar and aphid populations moved through the same fields. At the same time, northern China was struck by drought, and portions of the Huai River basin experienced flooding. For a while, in Beijing, these developments were reported as a temporary setback. But they were not a setback. They were the beginning of the collapse. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The 1958 harvest had never been what the announced figures said it was. Local officials throughout the commune system, aware that underreporting production could lead to being labeled a rightist and punished, had inflated their numbers substantially. The true 1958 harvest, reconstructed by Chinese economists and demographers in the decades that followed, was closer to 200 million tons, roughly half of the official figure. Beijing had extracted grain quotas from the communes based on the inflated reports. The surplus that the leadership was celebrating had never existed. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense. In 1959, as the famine was beginning to kill people in the countryside of Anhui and Gansu, China exported approximately 4.2 million metric tons of grain. The export figures come from Chinese customs records, cited by historian Frank Decatur in his 2010 book, Mao's Great Famine. The exports continued: 2.7 million metric tons in 1960 and 1.1 million metric tons in 1961. China was repaying debts to the Soviet Union and maintaining the public appearance that the Great Leap Forward was delivering results. Everything the Great Leap Forward had constructed was about to be turned against the people who depended on it. In the villages of Anhui, Gansu, and Hunan, people were dying of hunger. This is the part that stays with you. The famine that would later be called the Great Chinese Famine ran from 1959 through 1961 and into 1962 in some of the worst affected regions. Its geography was specific, and its causes were interlocking. Anhui Province, in eastern China, lost somewhere between 2 and 5 million people. Sichuan Province, the most populous in China, lost an estimated 10 million or more. Gansu and Qinghai, in the arid northwest, lost proportions of their populations that demographers have described as among the highest recorded in any modern famine. The individual death registers for most of this period were either falsified upward, suppressed by provincial officials, or destroyed. There is one account that brings this inside the experience of a single person. Yang Jisheng was a student at Tsinghua University in Beijing in 1959. His father was a farmer who had lived in a village in Hunan Province, reorganized into a commune in 1958. Before the communes, the family had farmed their own land. After the communes, they farmed the collective's land and received grain from the collective's administration. When the collective ran short, there was nowhere else to go. When communication from home went quiet, Yang Jisheng returned. He found his father in the late stage of famine edema. The tissue swelling that marks the body's response to prolonged starvation had spread to his legs and abdomen. He was eating tree bark stripped from the poplars near the farmhouse, mixed with wild roots and whatever organic material remained in the fields. The commune granary behind the village was locked. The grain inside, whatever remained, was collective property. Taking food from the collective without authorization was a political offense, punishable by imprisonment. In the village, no one was willing to record the cause of death. The word starvation was not available in the system's vocabulary for this period. But the body recorded what the system would not. Yang Jisheng's father died of starvation. The account is documented in the opening pages of Tombstone, the book Yang Jisheng spent 13 years researching, drawing on county archives, provincial death registers, and interviews with survivors across multiple provinces. The English translation was published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in 2012. Yang Jisheng estimates that alongside his father, in those same years, 36 million people died the same way. That number, 36 million, sits near the middle of the scholarly range. Jasper Becker, in his 1996 book Hungry Ghosts, put the death toll at approximately 30 million. Frank Decatur's 2010 research, drawing on provincial archives that became accessible during China's reform period, put the figure at closer to 45 million. The American demographer Judith Bannister, in her 1987 study China's Changing Population, was among the first Western researchers to attempt a systematic demographic reconstruction and reached approximately 30 million. Each of these scholars worked from different sources and different methodologies, but they converged on roughly the same order of magnitude. That is not a typo, by the way. The Chinese government has never published an official death toll for the famine. The mechanics of the dying were enforced by policy. The commune system prohibited peasants from leaving their villages without a travel permit. Seeking food elsewhere was illegal. Eating grain from the collective granary without authorization was treated as theft, and in the political climate of the Great Leap Forward, theft was a state crime, punishable by imprisonment or worse. In some counties in Anhui and Gansu, party investigators later documented cases in which people caught taking food to survive were publicly executed. But even the most absolute enforcement of those rules could not produce grain that was not there. The commune's logic for grain distribution was the work point. Each laborer earned points for the days worked in the collective fields. Those points were exchanged for grain at harvest. But when the harvest was extracted at quota rates based on false production figures, what remained for distribution was, in many communes, close to nothing. A family that had worked the entire growing season might receive a grain allocation that lasted weeks. After that, there was nothing in the system to appeal to. The granary registers in some communes were padded with fictitious reserves, so that provincial officials could demonstrate compliance with quota targets, even as the people outside the granary walls were dying. But the padding meant that the next extraction cycle would also be calculated against figures that did not exist, and the cycle would repeat. In Xinyang Prefecture in Henan Province, an estimated 1 million people died between 1959 and 1960. The county officials who attempted to send accurate reports to Beijing were removed from their positions. During that same period, local officials continued filing reports describing adequate food supplies and normal conditions. But the granary registers and the death tallies were also kept, at the county level, and they said something different. That is the kind of number that makes accountants cry. And if that were the only disaster, this would already rank among the worst famines in recorded history. But then came 1960, and the second season of unchecked locusts across the same fields, and the continued extraction of grain from communes that had nothing left to give, and the continued export of grain across the border, and the continued prohibition on movement, and the continued punishment of anyone who tried to report what was actually happening. If you are finding this history worth knowing, consider subscribing to this channel. New documentaries land here every week. Enter Yang Jisheng, the investigator. In 1988, 29 years after his father died, he was a senior correspondent at Xinhua, the official Chinese state news agency. The famine had never been given an official name in China. There was no public inquiry into its causes. The published accounts that existed described the period as difficult years caused by natural disaster. Yang Jisheng began asking questions. But asking questions about the famine in 1988 was not a neutral act. The famine had no sanctioned history. Anyone who had spoken about it had done so privately, or not at all. He spent the next 13 years traveling to the provinces where records had survived and where survivors were still living. He went to Xinyang and Henan, where county death registers showed the scale of what had happened. He visited Gansu, where some counties had lost more than a third of their populations. He went to Anhui, where the combination of inflated harvest quotas, enforced grain extractions, and locust devastation had created conditions that local officials, in private diaries Yang Jisheng later found, described as beyond anything in their living memory. In one county archive in Gansu, he found a document in which a commune secretary, writing privately in 1960, had recorded what he saw. Grain fields stripped bare, granaries with locked doors, children unable to stand from weakness. The report was filed with the Provincial Party Committee. The committee acknowledged receiving it. The next report filed upward from that same province gave normal production figures. Yang Jisheng found both documents in the same folder. But that folder was not an exception. It was the rule, replicated across 31 provinces. The real question is what happened behind closed doors in those county party offices, those commune meeting halls, those provincial capitals where officials received the true reports and then filed the false ones upward. Yang Jisheng found documents in which local officials privately described the dying in detail. They wrote about it. They counted the bodies. And then they sent to Beijing the numbers that Beijing needed to see. But they also kept the originals. Up to this point, the narrative of the Great Leap Forward had held together on paper. That was about to flip. You would think someone would have said something. In the end, someone did. Nobody listened. Zheng Zhuoxin, the ornithologist who had warned that eliminating sparrows would unleash the insects, lived through the famine years in Beijing. He was not imprisoned. He continued his work at the Institute of Zoology. His warnings from before the campaign were not refuted in public. They were simply absent from the official record, as though they had never been made. But after Mao Zedong's death in 1976 and the end of the Cultural Revolution, Zheng returned to publishing freely and was eventually recognized as one of China's foundational ornithologists. He died in 1998. There was never a public reckoning with what he had said in the years before the campaign, but the state did make one quiet admission, though it was never framed as one. The sparrow was quietly removed from the 4 pests list in 1960, replaced by bedbugs. The People's Daily did not publish an explanation. If you were a commune worker in Sichuan in the autumn of 1960, you simply heard that the list had changed. The insects that had devastated the harvests of 1959 and 1960 were never officially connected to the Sparrow campaign by any state institution. And no, I am not making that up. At the 7,000 Cadres Conference in January 1962, Mao Zedong acknowledged what he called 3 bad years of difficulty. He attributed the failures to drought, flooding, and the withdrawal of Soviet technical advisors. Liu Shaoqi, standing at the same podium, said something closer to the documented reality, that the famine was 3 parts natural disaster and 7 parts man-made disaster. He spoke about provinces where people had been subsisting on roots and bark. He said plainly that the deaths were preventable and that the system had failed the people it was meant to serve. Liu Shaoqi was removed from all party positions 6 years later and died in detention in 1969. But what he had said at the 7,000 Cadres Conference remained in the archive. The cause, as the state presented it, was weather. The Sparrow campaign was not mentioned. But the archive files, in the counties where they had survived, told a different story. People thought they had the full picture. They were wrong. Yang Jisheng's tombstone was published in Hong Kong in 2008 in 2 volumes. It draws on archives from 31 provinces and runs to nearly 1,200 pages in the original Chinese edition. It names counties. It provides village-level death tolls. It documents the officials who presided over the dying and the officials who attempted to report the truth and were punished for doing so. Its demographic estimate of the excess deaths is 36.29 million people. It remains banned in mainland China. But the archives it draws on exist, and some of them have since been seen by other researchers. Yang Jisheng described his father in the opening pages of that book. He was a farmer in Hunan province. He had worked the same land for most of his adult life. In 1959, when Yang Jisheng returned to find him, he was eating bark from the trees near the farmhouse. But the farmhouse and the trees and the fields were all still there. Only the grain was gone. That man died while the granary behind his village was padlocked. The grain inside had been set against a quota calculated from numbers that did not exist. The sparrows that had spent 10,000 years controlling the insects in those same fields were gone. The harvest that should have been there was roughly half the size of the figure on the official form. We cannot know, with certainty, what would have happened if a single link in that chain had been removed. If the Sparrow campaign had stopped after 1 season, if the harvest reports had been accurate, if the grain had not been exported. Each of those decisions was made by a specific person at a specific desk, signing a specific order. The combined weight of all of them is the famine that no official institution in China has ever named. But each of those decisions left a paper trail. The people who enforced the quota extractions had families of their own. Some of them are documented, in the private records Yang Jisheng recovered, as having written to their superiors requesting reductions in the extraction targets. Some were punished for making those requests. Some extracted the grain anyway and returned to their own villages to find what the rest of the countryside had already found. The system was not designed to recognize what it was doing because it was designed to report that everything was fine. But the bodies were harder to misrepresent than the harvest, and the body count survived. Today, the Eurasian tree sparrow is common again in the agricultural regions of Hunan and Sichuan. The bird that was declared an enemy of the state in 1958 has returned to the farmhouse eaves and to the fields. It eats insects. It eats grain seeds. It does what it has done for 10,000 years, inside an ecology that did not forget what it was for. But the 30 million people who died in the years when the sparrow was gone do not come back. In the provinces where the famine was worst, Judith Shapiro, writing in Mao's War Against Nature, published by Cambridge University Press in 2001, documented how the environmental disruptions of the Great Leap Forward compounded over decades. Soil erosion from cleared forests, waterways altered by mass irrigation campaigns, and the long shadow of an ecological order reshaped by a decree. Shapiro was among the first scholars to frame the famine not only as a political catastrophe, but as a consequence of a state deciding it could manage an ecosystem by command. The grain in those same fields enters the global food supply. The system it travels through is, in most places, more complex and more distributed than the one the Great Leap Forward tried to impose. But the lesson the famine taught, the one paid for in tens of millions of lives, is not complicated. An ecosystem does not recognize a political decree. The grain in your kitchen arrived here through chains of decision and ecology that are invisible to almost everyone in that chain. The people in the villages of Anhui and Hunan discovered what it costs when those chains are remade, suddenly, by one man's signature. Yang Jisheng dedicated tombstone to the memory of those who died in the famine, to those who survived, and to those who refused to be silent about what happened. The name of Yang Jisheng's father is in the opening pages of that book. 36 million other names are not. If this history matters to you, subscribe to this channel. Leave a question in the comments. Where does responsibility lie for a famine built from false numbers and silenced warnings? We read every comment. If this story has you asking how food became a catastrophe for the people it was meant to feed, we made a video called "The Crop That Starved Ireland." The mechanism is different, the pattern is not. Tap it on the end card right now and keep watching.